Self-development has become more prevalent on YouTube than syphilis was in 1499, and while it's safe to say that an abundance of positive driven advice is generally a good thing, and that by me criticizing it I'm basically drowning in my own sense of hypocrisy, I do have a want to discuss the manner in which this content is often consumed and how inadvertently it can actually hold many back from the deep positive change that they are craving. Of course, self-dev justifiably has a positive connotation, but that doesn't mean it's going to be a healthy influence all the time, with the influence of voices such as Dr. Jordan Peterson acting as a catalyst to creating a much larger community than we've ever seen before. I feel it's even more important now than ever to point out the dangers of consumption as self-development slowly becomes more and more of a main meal to the masses. I do think that such a plethora of content has changed the way we see interact with self-improvement ideologues, particularly in how it's made self-dev into more of a lifestyle brand. Your typical Instagram entrepreneur is an example of that. But as I said, I want to focus on the manner in which we consume this content, because in my estimation, this is the source of the many problems one could face when trying to improve. And yes, this might get a little confusing, so if you were thinking of sprinkling some MD in your coffee, I suggest you do it now. Have you ever noticed that when learning new content, some ideas form really well and then just others don't stick at all? When reflecting kind of rather cynically on what your typical self-dev content would be, I would say it's a 10-minute video of some lad having an absolute fun drum on Venice Beach. Perhaps he's teaching you how to get better with girls, which resonates with you because just a crumb of positive female attention is probably harder for you to find than Where's Wally-san Tokyo edition. And just like Tokyo, your unableness to reproduce has meant that you've taken his tips and you've tried to apply them in your life the quickest way possible, because people despise long-term growth more than they despise the recycled tea bag. But when we assess this actual process, can we honestly say that the new ideas that we learn are always implemented in a smooth and effective and a healthy manner? Not necessarily. Perhaps we are more confident in our romantic interactions in the short term, but find that overall our results are inconsistent. There are moments of success, of course, but often followed by a wagon of discontent. Are the new lines or body language cues really indicating that success comes from the genuine self? Often we quickly adopt new behavior, which is all good, but then the older beliefs we used to have start to permeate through again. We then run into loopholes where change slows, frustration ensues, and ultimately this has led to an innumerable amount of people who, while despite being keen students of the self-dev rhetoric that we all like and we all care about, are still feeling disenfranchised and bored, with the only answer being take more action. Now, of course, I understand that this is partly due to the natural process of learning, and there are some who suffer because of a lack of volume in their action. Of course, I realize that, that's fair. But what happens when similar issues start creeping in after 6 months, a year? I've personally seen some lads who are struggling after a decade. This is an example of the teachings of the self-development community lacking the ability to inform in a deeper fashion. But when we learn something new, it doesn't actually integrate with our personal cavern of learned beliefs, which has been shaped since our early formative years. Instead, the notion sits on top of what was there previously, kind of similar to a French pastry, or say London. When we become desperate for new advice, we often put our focus on what is there new to learn rather than what was there originally. It's an outcome of natural desire. Ultimately, despite the array of content out there, only a small percentage actually changes our deeper selves. If you take into account the innumerable amount of factors that goes into social dynamics, you'd realize how difficult it is to form deeper life changes. Your formation is unique. No person has been through the exact same experiences as you have, nor do they share the same genetic makeup. It's therefore now an imperative that any new advice that you take in, you individualize to your own level. If you believe that you're a simple jack and that any advice will work for you, then I would suggest spending more time in introspection. It's impossible for content creators to personalize their content, so you have to take responsibility to manufacture the advice to a bespoke level yourself. The only other alternative I could think of would be, say, coaching with a mentor, because then he or she could help you on that individual level that you'd be looking for. But I do realize that many are priced out from this bracket, particularly from the higher level mentors out there. As mentioned, I don't feel we spend enough time understanding our formation, but most importantly, why we formed in that particular manner. Ultimately, I feel that the pre-existing mindset normally formed in our more malleable younger years needs to be acquainted with before we then go and form more resounding change by learning new content. In any other situation, it would be complete madness to build something while completely disregarding the original context. It would be the equivalent of, say, Battersea Dog Zone building a new branch in Yulin, China. I guess for many the expectation was that the adoption of new advice would be discarded like a kind of rusty rushing machine into the greenbelt. But in truth, you can't just ignore your past beliefs like the inevitable piss-smelling swindler you find on the bus. Only through awareness, reconciliation and understanding of your existing beliefs, can you then move past them and connect with new ideas in a more wholesome manner? The usual reply when we go through this process: oh, you just need to take more action. And what does this lead to? The self-dev junkie. How often is it that when an idea doesn't work, the answer is just do more? We end up searching endlessly for new material, whereas before, to reach a sense of personal enlightenment, you would sit under a shrub or pillage some desolate town on a crusade. In the 21st century, it's about watching the 1,000th YouTube video. Ultimately, self-development becomes a personality trait in itself, where more often than not, we'd be far better being introspective. Normally the issue is within us. It's much better to remove layers than to add, I can tell you. I'm quickly going to list some of the signs that show you may be facing this kind of inner turmoil. Now, firstly, I want you to look for cyclical repetitive behaviors. Areas where you found it hard to implement new content despite spending a lot of time working on it. Rare, unexplainable negative traits, behavior in high emotion, reoccurring sticking points. I think you've got to examine parental behavior. Often I feel the best way to measure whether a new piece of information has connected to your deeper self is if the action corresponding to that belief is reflexive rather than something that you have to always be doing consciously. Note that just the finding and acceptance of this mindset and behavior patterns is a lot in itself. Just realizing it's there is important. In terms of creating space, accept its presence, it's not part of you. It wasn't a conscious process, but conditioning. It no longer serves you, so you can kind of just let it pass. Being patient with this process is necessary. It's more likely to resemble the drawing of a poison than a swift binary change overnight. Most people have a personal cavern of learned beliefs, behaviors, and characteristics about life, and most importantly, about themselves. When we learn new advice, it does not change who we really are. It simply sits on top of our original selves. This disparity causes poor implementation and an inner battle between new and old beliefs. As a solution, when adopting new material and beliefs, you first have to identify what was there beforehand. You have to understand why that mindset or behavior was formed, and then create space between it to let it go and to learn new ideas. Oftentimes, by letting the old mindset pass, you will become better without needing anything new because you're removing unnecessary layers. If you don't do this, you will not move past your inner demons, and new ideas will only sit on top of what was there beforehand. You then have to perpetually alter new advice to your own unique situation to make this work to the most effective manner it can. It is the mark of the educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Well, despite this quote being passed on YouTube more than the village bicycle itself, I so repeat it because I feel, to an extent, it has been taken for granted. Due to the displayed positivity, conviction, and sometimes pressures of the YouTube gurus and the array of content on show, we adopt new ideas, values, and behaviors all too easily, an outcome of the diminished distance between entertainment and adoption of thought. Because of this, our mind becomes less independent and we become synonymous with the group. This causes frustration, stagnation, but most importantly, a lack of innovation in our thinking. I know for a lot of people this process has worked rather organically, but in a community such as self-dev, which champions independence of thought and self-awareness, I can't help but feel that the ubiquitous life habits of the self-dev advocatee is now riddled with cognitive dissonance, and I think it comes down to this lack of space between entertainment and adoption of thought. To try and express this in an example, I'm going to again rather cynically try and guess a typical self-dev day, possibly with a hint of accuracy. I'll send you a Kit Kat chunky in the post if you can find all the points that express cognitive dissonance. So in this example, we're talking about the typical self-dev guy. I'm going to say he's 25, he lives by some sort of coast, and he describes himself as an entrepreneur in his Instagram bio. Now, I do realize that I may unintentionally describe myself, but that's life. You get up late because as an entrepreneur, getting up early is seen as absolute blasphemy. Cold shower to induce discipline, and also chances of a seizure both by about 90%. Hit the gym and get on the weights, but avoid cardio more than Lizzo avoids the green giant. Finally, you start work, but you have to replace it with a utility verb that has about a max of 2 syllables. Stop working to write a post about how you should always be working. Lunch that involves more protein that you'll be able to piss out fucking chicken breasts whole by the end of it. Back to the hustle. Gary V. still watching Gary Vee. The only point to take away is the fact that procrastination is a bad thing and that you should get back to work. Gary Vee. You consume some mushrooms from Chinese herb merchant. The mushroom itself resembles Tutankhamun's right toenail and tastes like absolute bin. But you live on a different paradigm of thinking, and so it's okay. After flogging a product to a guy who still wears goggles in the bath, with what you can only describe as light level Asperger's, for the price that's more heavily inflated than the Reich mark in the 1920s. Because you're feeling the vibe from your success, you do a post on Instagram about how you don't let the ego control your life. A complimentary photo is of you in full generic Gucci gear in front of your new 4-door estate. On your way to a date, with a Gary Vee podcast in the background as you walk because you're time efficient. Dinner is at a vegan restaurant paid by the Amex card out of your leather Louis Vuitton wallet. Conversation over dinner is how you don't let social media run your life. The fact that you met on Tinder doesn't really matter. History reading before bedtime. Gary Vee's new book on World War II, Jab Jab Jab, Left Hook. Ultimately the conclusion is that the access lost because they didn't release enough content. Let me be clear by saying that this lifestyle is far better than the absolute derpathon of irrational self-talk and basement living. I'm not dissing the great content that's out there. So much is available to be able to change your life in such a positive way. And as I mentioned at the start, I am well aware of my own hypocrisy. We are all capable of keeping 2 sets of books, and if we didn't, we would go mad. However, I do think there should be an ongoing attempt to reduce this kind of dissonance to the best we can, for the purpose of just simply high quality introspection and a clearer awareness of ourselves and of the situation that we're in. Of course, I don't want to condone being individual for individual's sake. As I mentioned earlier, I believe this all comes down from the correct adoption of new ideas without personal filter. So if you're wondering what the link is between, say, the level of dissidence and the quick adoption, I would say, well, it's not in the teachings of self-dev as to how to tie your shoes. It's often deep identity change. This is not on a scale that should be acquainted with and then initiated. When you fast track such radical change, that's when you start risking the path of contradiction, because your mind hasn't been able to fully entertain the idea, and therefore your actions don't always match your true mindset. Even pieces of advice that you would associate with positivity can always be seen in 2 frames of mind, and that's why it's so important to find out your natural frame and what works best for you. But being too positive can lead to delusion and poor quality in output. Being so happy can remove that human range of emotion that can be great for creativity and motivation. Failure is okay can lead to cyclical patterns, and it can reduce competition. It means learning the hard way. Even working too hard, for example, can lower creativity and quality overall. The point is that it's down to you to assess what works for your personal situation, and it's not always going to be the same. Of course, these gurus are going to think their advice is going to be the best for you, but that's not always the case. It's down to your situation. As mentioned in the earlier point, since online advice is not bespoke to your personality, you have to personally modify it yourself. So referring back to Aristotle, the next time someone gives you some life wisdom, you've got to realize that you need to take it for 5 days before you even contemplate the idea of taking it in for coffee in your mind. Not what usually happens, which is accepting a thought as you just 10 seconds after learning it. You have to think about these ideas. As I said, increase the space between yourself and what self-dev teaches, regardless of how well the nature of the idea seems to be. Ultimately, success is not defined by the number of books, videos, and lectures you have attended, but instead how well you can translate these teachings and sometimes even preachings into everyday life and into a style that works for you personally.